I come from a small town, one where the majority of the population is over 50 years old. And as such, whenever I would talk with my coworkers or the people around me about reading Dune for the first time and really enjoying the recent films, they would all talk about how much they enjoyed the one from 1984 by David Lynch. In fact, many of these people said they enjoyed that adaptation far more than the recent ones by Denis. And so I decided to give it a watch for myself, and having done that, I can confidently say that they are all wrong. I went into this expecting cheesy 80s sci-fi, kind of like a goofy episode of Star Trek from back in the day. And while it does have some of that charm, it just doesn't work for a multitude of reasons. Even Lynch himself agrees that this movie fell short of the masterpiece that is this novel. In his very extensive catalog of films, this is the only one that David Lynch himself considers to be a failure. And so today I wanted to take a look at the 1984 adaptation of Dune and the reasons why I think it just doesn't hold up. Not in terms of technology, in terms of quality. And I want to be clear, this video is not just going to be however many minutes this video ends up being of me punching down on this movie. As much as I love a good roast, that's not entirely what I want this video to be. So while this is all meant to be in good fun, I am going to be pointing out as we go through the story of this movie several things that I genuinely enjoyed about this movie and things that I think are really cool. Of all the roasts that I do have about this movie, I only have one genuine complaint, but it's a very big one, so stick around to the end to see that. And as someone who's made no secret of the fact that he loves the adaptation of Dune by Denis, I'm going to be trying my best not to compare it to David Lynch's version as much as possible. But it is gonna happen, just so you know. The main thing I will say is that I think Denis absolutely made the right choice in splitting his film into two parts, because man does this story need it. And so with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and let's get into it. We open this movie with a shot of the stars, and then a woman's face fades into view. This is the Princess Irulan, the daughter to the Emperor. This introduction immediately screams cheesy sci-fi from the 80s. To me, it just reminded me of Pigs in Space from The Muppet Show. And she is here at the start of the movie to give us an expositional monologue. It is the year 10,191, a distant point in the far future where apparently only white people are left in the universe. This is probably the most terrifying concept in this movie. She talks about Arrakis and the spice melange and how it is necessary for interstellar travel. She also talks more in depth about the Guild Navigators, a topic which I am very interested in. This will be elaborated on visually later, but for now we learned that the Guild Navigators, after millennia of consumption of the spice, have mutated into, well, we'll see later. These navigators fold space and time around their vessels, allowing them to travel vast distances without even moving. Now, I'm pretty sure in the books it works that the Guild Navigators use their prescient abilities to chart a safe passage through the stars, but whatever. That is probably the least of this movie's horrendous breaks from Dune canon. And then finally, of course, she talks about the Fremen and how for years they have held this prophecy of a savior from the outer world who will deliver them from the Harkonnens and usher in a golden age on Arrakis. And only then do we get to the theme of the opening credits. And let me say, the opening theme is an absolute banger. And speaking of which, in my research, I discovered that the majority of the soundtrack for this movie was made by Toto. Yes, the band that did Africa. And after the opening credits, we are treated to even more exposition, this time from a guild member, the Spacing Guild. This is the guild that has a monopoly on interstellar travel. This sets up the planets involved in this story, namely Arrakis, Caladan, the homeworld of the Atreides, and Gedi Prime, the homeworld of the Harkonnens, which they refer to as Harkonnens, which I just wasn't able to get over through the entire viewing. Harkonnen just does not sound right to me, but that's very nitpicky. The guild has recently been made aware of political instability within the Imperium that could jeopardize spice production on Arrakis. And so a guild navigator is sent to meet with the Emperor himself, Shaddam IV. And it is here on the Emperor's home planet that we are introduced to one of the things that I really, really love about this movie, and that is the absolute grandiose and elaborate set design and the detail in the costume design. Both are things that I thoroughly love about this movie throughout. The Emperor waits for the Guild Navigator's arrival along with Reverend Mother Gaius, the truthsayer to the Emperor. In the novel, Bene Gesserit can read a person's intentions by the slightest of body language and even by the inflection of their voice. But in this movie, they're just telepathic, which seems lazy, but okay. The Spacing Guild arrives along with a giant tank that contains a guild navigator. And just as a bit of a morbid fact about this scene, apparently the costumes for the Spacing Guild members were made with used body bags. And yes, I said used. And before you ask, no, the actors were not told about this until after shooting this movie. The guild says that what they have to say is for the Emperor's ears only and requests that the Reverend Mother depart. She goes to the next room, but being telepathic, she just listens anyways. And this is already another big departure from the lore of Dune. In the books, the closest thing to true telepathy is the gift of prescience, or prescience, whatever you call it. This is the ability to see into the future, although it has certain caveats. One of them is that there are these nexus events, or events whose repercussions are so impactful on the future that people with prescience cannot see past them. A great example of this is Paul's fight with Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen. Paul was able to see the fight coming, but he couldn't see past the fight. The entire future of the known universe hanged on which of them survived that encounter. And another big caveat of prescience, one that is explored in Dune Messiah, is that those with this gift cannot see guild navigators. Obviously, they can physically see guild navigators with their eyes, but what I mean is that these beings that spend their whole lives consuming the spice act almost as interference for someone with prescient abilities. Paul himself cannot see the actions of a guild navigator or anyone in the vicinity of a guild navigator. All this to say that the Reverend Mother should not be able to see anything that's going on in that room, even if she's telepathic. And once she leaves, the tank opens and we get a glimpse at what a guild navigator looks like, a person who has spent thousands of years consuming spice. This human has been mutated into a giant, almost infant-looking creature, one with a ginormous head and a beak-like mouth. This is possibly the most horrifying concept in all of Dune. Even in the books, they may not look exactly like that, but they are viewed as these horrific abominations of people that live in these giant tanks. Guild navigators are also prescient, and this guild navigator has sensed a rising feud between House Atreides and House Harkonnen, and he has also sensed that the Emperor has a hand in aiding the Harkonnens. See, the Emperor is aiding the Harkonnens out of fear that the Atreides are growing stronger, and he specifies that they are utilizing a new technique unknown to the Emperor involving sound. This is our first mention of a change from the novel to the screenplay that I found very stupid, but we're gonna get to that. Rather than the story laying out any form of mystery or intrigue, this is where the Emperor just blurts out his entire diabolical plan. He is sending the Atreides to Arrakis to replace the Harkonnens, and once they have settled there, the Harkonnens will annihilate them along with 5 legions of Sardaukar. Both the Guild and the Bene Gesserit are aware of this plan, however, there is an element that neither of them expected. An anomaly in House Atreides that they cannot account for, and that is Paul Atreides, the son to the Duke.
Paul Atreides, we want him killed.
It is not expressly said, but it is clear that the Spacing Guild is very nervous about the danger that Paul represents, and they insist that in whatever struggle is about to happen, that Paul Atreides must be killed. With this, the Guild Navigator leaves, and the Reverend Mother Gaius informs the Bene Gesserit that Paul must be tested. And then a voiceover by the Princess Irulan gives us even more exposition. You may have noticed at this point that most of the lore we get in this movie is delivered by just the most inorganic expositional monologues possible. This one mentions that the Bene Gesserit have been manipulating bloodlines for millennia to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, which, no matter how bad I am at saying it, at least I don't sound as white saying it as the Princess Irulan does.
The powerful Bene Gesserit sisterhood for 90 generations has been manipulating bloodlines to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, a super being.
And now, 11 minutes into the movie, we meet our protagonist, Paul. And he is played by Kyle MacLachlan. And I have a couple things to say about that casting. Firstly, I kind of set myself up for failure because the first thing I ever saw Kyle in was How I Met Your Mother, and in that, he is a middle-aged man, obviously. So I really have a hard time believing him as a child because even in this role, I still see him as a grown man. And the other thing I have to say about this casting is that I love it. Kyle MacLachlan is amazing, and I love him. This was apparently also Kyle's film debut, his first ever role in a film, which is amazing considering that he was and still is a lifelong fan of Dune. And as another side note, I've made it clear, I hope, that I love the set design of this movie, and that is especially true with Castle Caladan. Everything looks very old and ornate, like a true great house of some distant but old future. And it is in Paul's private studies that we get even more inorganic exposition. I know I promised I wouldn't compare this adaptation to Denis' films a lot, but at least his films integrated the lore so much more organically than this movie did. He is studying up on the human computers known as mentats, and how you can recognize them from their stained red lips, which is a detail taken from the novels, but how it looks in this film is just... we'll get to that. And as Paul studies, 3 men enter the room. The first of them is Gurney Halleck, who is played by Patrick Stewart, which I love. Patrick Stewart is amazing.
I'm not in the mood.
Not in the mood. Mood's a thing for cattle and love play, not fighting.
And as a side note, a friend of mine was talking about reading Patrick Stewart's memoir, Making It So, which I love as a fan of Next Gen. And in his memoir, he talked about his time filming Dune as being a very miserable experience, which I was very sad to hear about. Not because of the conditions on set, but because the entire time he was filming, he felt miscast in this role. You see, David Lynch had supposedly seen Patrick Stewart in a theatrical performance in which he played an older man, complete with, the makeup and everything. And so when Patrick arrived on set, he was surprised that he didn't look like that. And so the entire time he felt that he had been miscast in this role. Now personally, I love Patrick Stewart, and I think he did a great job in this movie. In my list of complaints about this movie, Patrick Stewart is not one of them. Gurney is here to test Paul's shield and combat skills. The two activate their shields, which, they're something else. I know it's unfair to expect good visual effects from an old sci-fi movie, but like, why are they Minecraft characters? And just to get ahead of the CGI allegations, these shields were rotoscoped by hand by visual effects artists. I have a huge amount of respect for VFX artists and CGI artists in the modern day, but these shields are not it. After this test of combat, Paul is examined by Dr. Yue, who is played by Dean Stockwell. They also call him Dr. Yui in the movie, which I find extremely weird. It's Yue. There are so many names that I feel like they get wrong in this movie. The Harkonnens, Yui. I know it's a minor complaint, but like, it was bugging me the entire time I watched it. He and Paul briefly talk about the sandworms on Arrakis. Apparently, in the deep deserts, they can reach lengths of up to 450 meters, which is almost the length of 3 Washington monuments, or nearly half as long as Angel Falls. Paul also talks about the Fremen, the indigenous inhabitants of Arrakis, and how exposure to the spice has saturated their blood, giving them blue within blue eyes. And finally, the last man is Tufir Huwat, who is played by Freddie Jones. They also call him Thufir in this movie, but I am still very much willing to die on the hill that it's pronounced Tufir. Sometimes TH just makes the T sound. And this is one of those times. And this is also one of the rare instances in this movie where I just do not like the costume design at all. See, when you think of someone who is supposedly a human computer as well as a master in this great house, what do you think that person should look like? I think of someone kind of like Tufir in Denis Dune, a neatly groomed, snappy looking guy. And Tufir in this film more closely resembles a functioning alcoholic. Especially with the way they decided to do the red-stained lips. He looks certifiably insane. I know in the books Mentats are supposed to have red-stained lips, and they don't do that in Denis Dune, but you could have come up with something better than this, right? It looks like he was gorging himself on red popsicles and then just forgot to clean himself. Tufir rightly calculates that the Harkonnens won't let go of Arrakis without a fight, and Paul agrees, but he also suspects that the Emperor is somehow behind this. And then Tufir asks Dr. Yue to bring Paul what is called a weirding module. And trust me, I have some thoughts about these things. Namely that I hate them. Tufir gives the command and this futuristic combat dummy lowers from the ceiling. See, remember when the Emperor mentioned that the Atreides were utilizing this new technique involving sound? Well, that takes the form of the weirding module, which is quite possibly the dumbest invention in all of sci-fi I have ever read about, and certainly the dumbest thing created for this movie. It is a device that converts audible sound from the wielder into a projectile. It's so dumb to me, not even because of the concept, but because there was no reason to add this to Dune. This isn't in Dune at all. The Dune universe already has laser weapons, just use those. Using this module, Paul successfully beats this training exercise. Later, of course, Paul meets Duncan Idaho, who's being sent ahead to broker alliances with the Fremen. And at last, we meet Paul's father, the Duke Leto Atreides, who they call Leto Atreides, but no, I'm not going to. I swear, it's like Lynch intentionally picked the worst way to pronounce each person's name and just went with that. It's established almost immediately that the Duke really loves his son Paul and is proud of the man that he's becoming, which is very wholesome. And I love this adaptation of the Duke as well. He was performed amazingly. And that night, Paul dreams a series of images. The first is a man grinning psychotically, threatening to kill Paul. The next is a woman with blue within blue eyes.
Tell me of your homeworld, Usul.
This, of course, is Chani. And just a side note here, because I wasn't sure where to insert this, but the actress for Chani, Sean Young, apparently recorded footage on set, like just behind the scenes footage of her and the cast and crew using an old Super 8 camera. And in 2010, she published 6 minutes of behind the scenes footage from shooting Dune on YouTube, along with a voiceover narration from Sean herself. The narration is incomplete in parts, but it is really cool seeing these candid moments with the cast and the crew, as well as seeing these really accomplished actors just eating cafeteria style with each other. I thought it was insanely cool. And so if you're interested in watching 6 minutes of behind the scenes content from Dune set to Scott Joplin music, then I will hopefully have put the link in the description below so you can check that out for yourself. And that night, Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, waits outside the house for the arrival of the Reverend Mother. Now, there have been a few examples of a technique that I haven't talked about at this point, but much of the dialogue of this movie is delivered through voiceovers of the internal monologues of characters. This is not necessarily bad in itself, although it does result in much of the movie just being us staring at actors being like, but that's not really bad in itself. What I found really uncomfortable about it is that all of these characters are just whispering very closely into the microphone, delivering their monologues.
No man has ever been tested with the box.
Arrakis. Dune. Desert planet.
Yes. Perhaps he would have that.
I came into this expecting 2 hours and 17 minutes of the most amazing sci-fi epic ever, and ended up just getting ASMR. It was very uncomfortable to sit through. And through this ASMR monologue, Jessica talks about the imminent test of Paul and how this could be the night that she loses her son. The Reverend Mother arrives and immediately begins chastising Jessica. She was told to only give birth to daughters, but because of her love for the Duke, she gave him a son. Apparently, the Bene Gesserit had planned to wed the daughter of the Atreides to a son of the Harkonnens, which I don't know what it is with famous stories with complex political tones always devolving into incest, but here we are. They never actually say in this movie that Jessica is the daughter of Vladimir Harkonnen, but yeah, so I don't know why I need to explain this to authors, but hey, incest is bad. And of course that plan was foiled when Jessica gave birth to a son, and now the Bene Gesserit may potentially lose both bloodlines. And so the Reverend Mother chastises her for thinking that she could produce the Kwisatz Haderach. They've arranged safe passage for Jessica and Paul on Arrakis, but for the Duke Atreides, they can do nothing. This, of course, is heard by Paul, but he doesn't get a say in this, and he's about to be tested. He enters the library where the Reverend Mother is waiting and demands to know what she meant about his father, but obviously they don't answer. He has no idea that the Bene Gesserit have already sanctioned his father's murder. And as soon as Jessica leaves, the Reverend Mother uses the voice to compel Paul forward. He initially resists, but the Reverend Mother, of course, is far more experienced than him. In this adaptation of Dune, the voice sounds almost snake-like and is shown to put people into a trance. And the actual sound design of the voice is pretty dorky. I mean, just listen to this. Compared to the monument to sound design that is this.
You dismissed my mother in her own house.
Come here, kneel.
In this film, the voice is basically just reverb. And the test itself plays out exactly as it does in the book and in Denis' films. Got the box, got the needle. Although in this adaptation, the Gom Jabbar needle is actually a needle worn around the finger of the Reverend Mother, which is a design choice that I found very interesting. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just interesting. And as the pain in the test begins to mount, Paul recites in his mind the Bene Gesserit litany against fear, which I haven't really ever talked about, but I do love the mind over matter principle that is the litany against fear. The 1984 film cuts it off, but I do want to read the litany against fear just once because I think it's really cool. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn my inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. I didn't really have to read it. I just love this mantra and I wanted you all to hear it too, in case you haven't read the book. And there's this really cool practical shot of a hand being burned by acid, which reminds us of the unbearable amounts of pain that Paul is being exposed to. And finally, the Reverend Mother relents, admitting that Paul has withstood more pain in this test than any Bene Gesserit in living memory. Hey everyone, it's your boy in the editing studio with yet another interruption. And that interruption is to say that from here on out, there is no video to accompany my audio narration for the rest of this video because I messed up the recording and it is entirely my fault. I have no one but myself to blame. I know exactly what I did and I can't fix it. And the audio continued to go until the end of my recording, which was another 2 hours. I didn't feel like re-recording the last 2 hours of footage, and so I came up with a different solution. I am taking the lovely background that you see behind you and that you see in the video, and I'm going to be placing this guy, my little character, in the video for me. That's all I have to say. I hope that you enjoy the rest of this video, even though you won't get to see this lovely mug, but I hope that you still enjoy, and I will catch you all later. Back to the video now. And in her mind, Gaius considers, what if this boy is the Kwisatz Haderach? And if he is, can the Bene Gesserit control him? She asks Paul what he knows about the water of life. The Bene Gesserit use this fluid to look within. This is genetic memory, where the Bene Gesserit expose themselves to the knowledge and the memories of all Bene Gesserit who came before them. She explains that in this state of looking inward, there is a place so dark that no Bene Gesserit can look there. A place so terrifying that they are physically repulsed by it. This dark place is where the Kwisatz Haderach will go. And after this, we are taken to Gedi Prime, the homeworld of the Harkonnens. Being a house that represents the evils of industry, I do love the grimy, smog-filled version of Gedi Prime that is in this movie. And now that I've said a nice thing, I can say that I absolutely hate this version of the Baron. I hate him. He's the worst. But first we see Piter, the Baron's mentat. He's called Piter in the movie. I don't know whether it's Piter or Peter, but I don't know. Apparently in this adaptation of Dune, mentats looking psychotic and sloppy is a pattern. He is consuming sappho juice, a drink that amplifies the mental abilities of mentats, allowing them to be human computers. It also stains their lips red, so that's why they look like that. There's also a surprising amount of body horror on Gedi Prime as well, which I appreciate. The doctors and servants to the Baron have their eyes and their ears sewn shut. And finally, we come to the Baron, who is by far the absolute worst possible adaptation of the character I have ever seen, especially in his design. Rather than the bald, austere, and conniving version of the Baron we get in Denis Dune, this version is loud, megalomaniacal, and extremely just hideous. His face is covered in boils that ooze with blood and pus. I can confidently say after watching this movie that Stellan Skarsgård is just simply the better Baron performance and design. Peter delivers the news to the Baron that the Duke has refused to meet with him. Outraged, he summons his nephews, the Beast Rabban and Feyd-Rautha. Rather than Rabban being just the pinnacle of rage and savagery, as his nickname kind of implies, he's just kind of dumb in this movie. I mean that very literally. In this movie, Rabban is just the archetype of the big, strong, dumb henchman. That's what he is throughout this whole film. And Feyd-Rautha is Sting. Yes, Sting from the band The Police. Sting from the B movie. That's who Feyd-Rautha is. Rabban's personality is strong dumb guy, and Feyd-Rautha's personality is Sting. That's all you need to know. They are both instructed to act with discretion because word of the Emperor's involvement in this operation cannot reach the Landsraad. Then there's a shot of Rabban crushing a little creature to death and drinking its juices, which... okay. The creature was made up entirely for this movie and apparently is called a squood. I kid you not, in my research I found out that it's called a squood. The Baron also tells his nephews that there's a traitor in House Atreides. He even says a line straight out of the novel.
The Duke will die before these eyes, and he'll know that it is I, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, who encompasses his doom.
But coming from this version of the character, it just comes across as goofy. That's really how this entire character comes off in this movie, is very goofy. He then activates his suspensors and floats above the ground, which... I'll let you compare for yourselves which of these is goofy and which of these is very cool and intimidating.
My desert. My Arrakis. My Dune.
And I promise I'm not just roasting his floating scenes because of how obvious it is that he's attached to wires. It's just the whole image for me is just bad. Both the designs and the characterization of the Harkonnens in this adaptation of Dune really do represent everything that I dislike about 80s filmmaking and 80s costume designs. There are amazing costume designs in this movie, but the Harkonnens are not it. The Baron then showers himself in oil and kills one of the boy's servants and caresses his face while he dies, which is insanely creepy and weird, but is also a lot more accurate to the Baron in the novel than he is in Denis films. So there is 1 point for Lynch there. It feels very sadistic serial killer, which is accurate to his character. And back on Caladan, House Atreides prepares to depart to Arrakis. The Duke is holding a little pug, which is not a detail from the novel, but I don't care because it's adorable and I love him. And with that, millions of spacecrafts leave Caladan and board a massive guild liner. And this is a really cool scene because we get to see how space travel works in Dune, at least in Lynch's adaptation of Dune. And when every ship has boarded the liner, a guild navigator who is floating in a massive chamber of spice folds space around the ship and takes them to Arrakis. And visually, this is such a creative sequence, which I love so much. And the score for when they arrive on Arrakis is just genuinely beautiful. And it is then that we see a shot of a Reverend Mother. Not the Reverend Mother, but a Reverend Mother. One with blue within blue eyes. She speaks of one who is nearly here, a voice from the outer world. A person who will bring about a holy war. And I have very strong thoughts about what we just saw that I will elaborate on at the very end. Then the Duke, Paul, and Gurney all meet with Dr. Kynes, and this scene plays out pretty much as it does in both the book and in Denis' film. The Doctor inspects the still suits, Paul put his on right the first try, and they leave in an ornithopter. I'm not going to spend too much time on the scenes that are exactly as described in the book and in Denis' films, because I don't really have anything new to say on that. And back in the city, Dr. Yue performs autopsies on Harkonnen agents. In the body of one of these agents is a cylindrical rod. This is a message cylinder for Yue himself.
My message, it's here.
This, for us, is the grand reveal that Yue is in fact the traitor. And the company in the ornithopter arrive at a spice harvester, and that plays out exactly as it does in the book and in Denis' film. But what I really want to focus on in this scene is just how cool the worms look. I know objectively that this is just a hand puppet in a bucket of sand, but how they execute these shots of the worms is so well done. And I love the designs, they're incredible. And while they were doing the rescue operation, Paul was of course exposed to the spice, and so when they come back to the city, he starts tripping balls. And after a series of very obscure LSD-infused images, a hunter-seeker is sent into Paul's room. He remains completely still, the Shadow Mapes opens a door and activates the hunter-seeker, and Paul saves her life. And as thanks for saving her, she reveals that the Fremen know that there is a traitor in the midst of House Atreides. More like House Atreider, am I right? After this failed assassination attempt, House Atreides goes on high alert, but unfortunately that's not enough. That night, the Duke says goodnight to his son, completely unaware of the fact that Paul is screaming at him quietly that he has been drugged.
Father, drugged.
And down the hallway, Leto sees the body of the Shadow Mapes, who dies in his arms. And as he stands, he is hit by a drugged dart, and that is when Yue reveals himself as the traitor. Yue lowers the Atreides' shields, and the Harkonnens begin their invasion. He also destroys all of the Atreides' weirding modules, which again, were made up for this movie for dumb reasons. And then Yue replaces one of the Duke's teeth with a poison tooth to kill the Baron. The Baron captures Paul and Jessica, and while the Baron gloats, we get a shot of Yue in his room crying. Which is a great reminder that while he was the traitor in House Atreides, he wasn't a willing traitor. He did it to try and save his wife. Of course, he didn't count on the fact that she was already dead, but I guess if I were married, I wouldn't want to believe my wife was dead either. Fair enough, I guess. And the Baron spits in Jessica's face, which, gross. Don't know why he did that. He leaves, and then Peter starts talking very creepily to Jessica, which is actually very accurate to his character in the novel. So, yay, I guess. Thankfully, he doesn't do anything creepy. He just orders them to be taken to the desert to die. Duncan, meanwhile, leads a counterattack to try and rescue Paul and Jessica, but he uses his shield the whole time, so it just looks dumb. And unlike in the novel and in the more recent film adaptation, Duncan is killed in this scene. Peter also kills Yue, not realizing that even though he was a traitor, he gave Paul and Jessica a way out.
You think you've defeated me? You think I don't know what I gained from my wife?
Because he left a bunch of supplies on the ornithopter that they're being taken away in. And one of the Harkonnens, taking them to their deaths, starts talking to Jessica very creepily, which at this point is kind of a theme. And then, just as in the new adaptation, Paul uses the voice to get him to remove Jessica's gag, and then she does the rest of the work. They manage to kill the Harkonnens and take control of the ornithopter. And by ornithopter, I mean science fiction hovercraft that doesn't resemble an ornithopter at all. And then the Baron and the Duke finally meet face to face. This scene plays out very much the same as well, except in this version, in his drugged state, the Duke thinks that Peter is the Baron. And so when Peter gets close, he releases the poison gas, killing Peter, and not even getting close to killing the Baron. I know he did it for love, but boy did he screw up. It's much more dramatic and heroic in Denis' adaptation because he actually does it to the Baron, you know? Jessica, of course, starts crying, which is very understandable in this situation, but I like Paul's performance even more in this moment. He's very well composed, but his eyes are wide with rage, and his voice speaks with this cold certainty that seems like it was pulled straight out of the book.
I know.
In a movie where Kyle has had little to no time to shine as an actor, this was a great moment for him. And meanwhile, back in the city, the Baron is just as not dead and over the top as ever.
I'm alive, huh? I'm alive!
I can't really describe how much this performance feels like nails on a chalkboard for me. Paul and Jessica then crash land. She continues having a mental breakdown, and Paul continues not feeling anything. Which sounds bad, but this is a detail pulled right out of the book. It's missing the full context around it, but at least a part of it made it in. And in the desert, Paul's prescient abilities begin to kick in again. He sees the conversation between the Emperor and the Guild Navigator, which again, I have to emphasize, people with prescient abilities can't see Guild Navigators. So, -1 point, I guess. And he also sees the Baron and the same psychotic, laughing man who we now know is Fade Rotha, who is played by Sting, which is incredible. And next he is shown a baby, specifically the one that his mother is currently pregnant with. And the rest of his vision feels like an LSD-induced fever dream, which, yeah, that's pretty accurate to Dune, actually. From this, he sees that they must go to the Fremen, and they will call him Muad'Dib. In the pack that Yue left them is a tent, still suits, and schematics for the weirding modules, which, if I haven't hammered this point home hard enough at this point, was a dumb invention for the purposes of this movie that doesn't exist in the novel, and we'll see why it was invented later, and the reasons are just as dumb as I'm making them out to be. And back in Arrakis, the Harkonnens get settled in. Dr. Kynes is deprived of his still suit and given to the desert to die. Tufir has also been captured, and we'll see a little bit more of his fate later. Then Paul and Jessica cross the desert by night. And there's not much to say about this scene, except that there's really cool shots of the sandworms, as well as really poorly aged shots of Paul and Jessica in front of a green screen. They then, of course, run into Stilgar and his band of Fremen. He says that he will take Paul in and teach them the ways of the Fremen, and in response, Paul and Jessica start attacking them.
I will take the boy man. He shall have sanctuary in my tribe.
Which doesn't really make any sense, but okay. In the book, it's because Stilgar says that Jessica will be given back to the desert to die, but he straight up does not say that in this movie, so they just attack him completely unprompted. It's like if I said, oh yeah, for sure, you can stay at my place for the night. Here's the spare room, eat anything out of the pantry. All good. And then you just stabbed me. I don't know, man. Like in the book, Jessica defeats Stilgar in combat, who is known for being one of the best Fremen warriors, so everyone's like, whoa. And in exchange for sanctuary, she offers to teach the Fremen how she fights, which, spoiler alert, that doesn't happen. She gets sanctuary, but there's no training. And on his high vantage point that Paul climbed to in the struggle, he is jump scared by Chani. Unlike in Denis' adaptation, Chani immediately refers to herself as the daughter of Dr. Kynes, which is in the book. That is a detail from the book. I know they changed Dr. Kynes to a woman in Denis' adaptation, but I feel like they still could have called her daughter, you know? It just adds another layer of connection to Paul and Chani. Of course, Paul recognizes her from his dreams and falls in love with her immediately because there's only 50 minutes of runtime left in this movie and we got a lot of story to get through. The two climb down and Paul is given the name of Paul Muad'Dib Usul. They entirely skip Paul's fight with Jamis because, again, there's no time. They are then led to a cave containing a giant wind trap. Wind traps are devices that capture what little moisture there is in the air of Arrakis and converts it into water. In this cave is a massive underground pond of moisture, and according to Stilgar, there are thousands such collections across Arrakis. Like in the novel, the plan is to gather as much water as they can over several generations, and finally, when they have enough water, they will be able to terraform Arrakis into this green paradise. And Chani also instantly begins to fall in love with this stranger she only just met because there's no time and the plot demands it. Meanwhile, the Baron continues being a silly goose of a villain. He laughs a bunch and gives Rabban control of Arrakis. Fade Rotha then arrives, and it's extremely heavily implied that the Baron is attracted to his nephew, which... gross. I don't know how much I have to keep saying this, but incest is bad. And now back to Paul and Jessica and the Fremen as they traverse the deserts of Arrakis. These sequences in the desert were shot in Mexico, and you can tell they were shot in Mexico because everything's orange. That's probably one of my favorite filmmaking jokes. How do you know a scene takes place in Mexico? Oh, we just take the color temperature and we just... Jessica is asked to replace their dying Reverend Mother by drinking the water of life. Through Princess Irulan and the power of expositional monologues, we find out that changing the poison caused Aaliyah, which is Jessica's daughter, to be born early. And when she was born with all the knowledge and wisdom of a Reverend Mother. And now on Gedi Prime, the Baron and Feyd-Rautha talk to their hostage, Tufir Hawat. In the book, Tufir is given a poison, and they regularly supply him with an antidote in order to keep him in line. But in this adaptation, they give him the poison, and in order to get the antidote, he has to milk a cat for some reason. This is a close second to me of changes from the novel to the movie that are just dumb. The first, of course, being the weirding module. And on Arrakis, Paul and Chani are together now, which, if you're thinking that feels very inorganic and sudden, yeah, it is. To be fair, it's kind of the same in the novel though, so I guess it's accurate. Paul then gives a speech to thousands of holy warriors, saying that he is now going to teach them the weirding way of himself and of his mother. Now, when you hear that, you may think that Paul is talking about teaching them his fighting skills, because that's certainly what was meant in the novel. But in this adaptation, it just means introducing the Fremen to weirding modules, the made-up thing for this movie that is basically just a MacGuffin so that David Lynch doesn't have to choreograph fight scenes. That's literally the only reason this thing was made up. It's like, oh yeah, there's supposed to be this really epic fight. What if we just have sound guns instead? Screw good fight scenes and any sense of adherence to the book. Give me some sound guns. Paul has a Fremen try to destroy an obelisk made of the strongest material on Arrakis, which obviously does nothing. Paul then immediately shatters it using a weirding module to the YouTube thumbnail reactions of all the Fremen in attendance. And Paul then explains how the weirding module works. Every person or object has a sound or a frequency, it's very vague, that can cause a physical response.
Through sound and motion, you will be able to paralyze nerves, shatter bones, set fires, suffocate an enemy or burst his organs.
And the weirding module is meant to generate this sound, but the wielder has to be able to find it and produce it. And so their training commences. During this time, one of the Fremen loses control of his module, repeating over and over again the name Muad'Dib. Paul sees this and immediately comments with apprehension that his name is a killing word. Normally, this would be great foreshadowing that the person of Muad'Dib is going to become associated with violence and dread. But in this movie, as we'll see, this and several other moments are completely wasted. He also sees that they're ready to fight, but in order to be a leader of the Fremen, he needs to ride the sandworm. And if you're thinking to yourself that this idea hasn't even been mentioned throughout the entire movie and that this transition feels very inorganic, like many others in this movie, you're absolutely right, but we're doing it anyways. This scene is done about as well as it can, given the fact that the sandworms are hand puppets and all of the actors are on a green screen. But the mechanics and the biology of the sandworms are very interesting in this movie, and I can't really fault it for having dated special effects. Or can I? Although Return of the Jedi did come out a year before, and I feel like the effects in that aged a lot better. Riding the sandworms also looks a lot easier in this version than in Denis Dune. Instead of struggling to stay on this gigantic creature moving at incredible speeds, he just kind of like walks across it, delicately setting up his reins as if he was on a boat, which I find hard to believe. And with that, Paul is made a Fremen leader, and he's given an elite guard of Fedaykin, and then he begins a military campaign disrupting Harkonnen spice production. And this continues for 2 years, during which time Paul's sister Aaliyah is born. And he's also reunited with Gurney Halleck, who also survived. Word of this conflict reaches the guild, and they order the Emperor to intervene. This is great because much like in the novel and in the real world, ultimately it's powerful corporations that have the true authority over even the most powerful politician. And right now, they want Muad'Dib dead. Paul sees all this in a dream, and he also knows that they want him dead because they are afraid he will drink the water of life. And so guess what he decides to do? The Emperor, fearing that his own power is on the line, unironically and quite literally orders the genocide of all Fremen. He even calls it genocide, which is utterly insane.
I want 50 Legion of Sardaukar on Arrakis at once. This is genocide. The deliberate and systematic destruction of all life on Arrakis.
Obviously then, Paul decides to drink the water of life in order to truly see. So he drinks it, and he is launched into a series of visions, all now crystal clear. He sees even the relationship between the sandworms and the spice. As if sensing what Paul has done, 2 gigantic sandworms arrive at Paul's side and almost seem to guard him. Paul begins crying blood, and across the entire known universe, all Bene Gesserit begin bleeding profusely from their noses. Paul's actions have caused ripples across the entire known universe, which is a really cool detail. There is a place in conscious memory that is so dark and terrifying that no Bene Gesserit dare go there. After taking the water of life, Paul looks into that place and becomes the Kwisatz Haderach. These are really cool words, but in the movie, it basically just means he understands how the sandworms work now and can control them, I guess. Now in a panic, the Emperor himself visits Arrakis. The Baron also arrives, outraged that Rabban has failed and fearful of what the Emperor will do. Meanwhile, Paul marches on Arrakeen, accompanied by, all Fremen ever. Paul orders Gurney to open the shield wall around the city using atomics. And if you find it a jump scare that they are only just now mentioning atomics with only 20 minutes left in the movie, then you're absolutely right. Moving on. Meanwhile, they have set off enough thumpers to summon what is scientifically known as a lot of sandworms. In the Emperor's ship, he summons the Baron and shows him the severed head of Rabban Harkonnen. A few Sardaukar arrive as well and bring a prisoner with them. This is Paul's sister, Aaliyah. And as she enters, the Reverend Mother Gaius appears physically disturbed. And as we find out, it's because Aaliyah is invading her mind.
Poor Emperor. I'm afraid my brother won't be very pleased with you.
Silence!
She begs the Emperor to destroy this abomination. A child Reverend Mother is a grotesque mutation in this universe, and we are quickly shown what exactly it means to be a child with the knowledge and wisdom of a Reverend Mother.
Get out of my mind! Not until you tell them both who I really am.
Gaius admits that she knows that this child is the daughter of Duke Leto Atreides, and that Muad'Dib is Paul Atreides. In other words, the Emperor's involvement in the destruction of the Atreides is about to come to light. In other words, the Emperor and the Baron are screwed. And with this, the assault on Arrakeen begins. With their worms and their weirding modules, the Fremen easily make quick work of the Emperor's Sardaukar. This is supposed to be the climactic battle of the film, and as the weirding module's #1 hater, they absolutely detract from this entire scene. There's basically no risk to the Fremen. They just blast the Sardaukar with their word guns from on top of their worm kaiju. These weirding modules were purely a convenient plot device in order to just not choreograph awesome fight scenes that would have been 10 times better anyways, as we've seen in Denis Dune. Meanwhile, Aaliyah kills the Baron with a Gom Jabbar needle. And I talked about in my last video why I think that is a very fitting death for the Baron symbolically, and that absolutely applies here as well. Except, as with every other scene in this movie, the Baron goes and ruins it by being a ridiculous, goofy shell of the character that's in the novel. Spiraling out of control, he is launched into the gaping maw of a sandworm. I think it's fair to say that Paul and the Fremen won this fight. He and his entourage enter the city and they are greeted by the now prisoners of war, the Emperor Shaddam, his daughter Irulan, the Reverend Mother Gaius, and Feyd Rautha Harkonnen. The Reverend Mother attempts to use the voice on Paul, who stops that immediately.
You mustn't speak!
He has become so powerful that he can kill with just a word. And then Feyd steps up to battle Paul to the death. While this fight is nowhere near as technically magnificent or as well choreographed as the fight in Denis' film, it is a lot more accurate to the fight in the novel. The two circle each other, occasionally striking in order to test the other's defenses. And Feyd even attempts to cheat using a hidden poisoned blade. But in the end, Paul outmaneuvers Feyd and kills him.
I will bend like a reed in the wind.
Then Paul screams and the ground splits at his feet. I guess. Like, Feyd wasn't dead enough already. He had to do like a Mortal Kombat finisher on him. This is a cool display of power, but the Fremen immediately ruin it by mentioning the weirding modules.
Muad'Dib. Usul no longer needs the weirding module.
This started out as half a joke. It is no longer a joke. I am the weirding module's biggest op. I have developed a Kendrick-level hatred for this convenient plot device. This device that adds nothing to the plot and only serves to devalue so many scenes in this film. The rest of the movie is accompanied by an expositional monologue by Princess Irulan. Paul Muad'Dib had now fulfilled the Fremen prophecy and would usher in an era of peace, as well as bring a green paradise to Arrakis. And suddenly it magically starts raining on Arrakis after it being a desert planet for millennia? I don't know.
And how can this be? For he is the Kwisatz Haderach.
And that's how the movie ends. Now, I think I've adequately talked about all the minor problems I had with this movie, as well as my many major grievances. And now it's time that I talk about the massive problem with 1984's Dune, and you probably noticed it right there at the very end. You may have remembered some moments throughout this movie that hinted at some terrible purpose for Paul. The Fremen prophecy of a jihad that would sweep across the entire universe. The name Muad'Dib being a killing word among the Fremen. If you've read the novels or watched Denis' films, you may have expected this story to end in a holy war led by Paul Atreides. You may have expected Paul drinking the water of life to transform him into a all-seeing but also very cruel ruler, because that's what's supposed to happen. Paul is supposed to ascend to the imperial throne as the Lisan al-Gaib and as the Kwisatz Haderach. He's supposed to manipulate Fremen culture to his advantage in order to get what he truly wants: revenge. I made the comment in my last video on how Paul's character arc at the end is very white savior in a really bad way, and Frank meant it to be in a bad way. And this is my big issue with 1984's Dune. In this adaptation, his arc is still very white savior, but that's seen as a good thing. He's not the tyrant in a making who would go on to slaughter billions in order to consolidate his power. He's the righteous hand of God who ushers in an era of peace and magically makes it rain on a planet that hasn't seen rain in millennia. The prophecy of the Lisan al-Gaib was Bene Gesserit propaganda, also that they could weaponize and control the Fremen using religion. But in this adaptation, the prophecy is seen as gospel, and Paul is seen as the chosen one. Frank Herbert himself commented on this ending, saying, "I have my quibbles about the film, of course. Paul was a man playing God, not a God who could make it rain." I can forgive the fact that they had to condense the story to fit it in one movie. I can also forgive the dated effects because honestly that adds some charm to this movie. The two things I can't get over are the weirding modules and the fact that David Lynch missed the point of Dune entirely. Dune was a warning against the very chosen one kind of mythos that Paul embodies in this movie. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy that Frank was trying to warn us about. And that's my big issue with this adaptation of Dune, but there are others. In my research, I discovered another more behind-the-scenes fact about this movie that possibly contributed to it not being good. And to explain that, here near the end of the video, we are introduced to another character by the name of Dino De Laurentiis. Dino was a Hollywood producer who produced movies like Conan the Barbarian and its sequel, Flash Gordon, Serpico, and the Hannibal movies that came after Silence of the Lambs. He didn't do Silence of the Lambs, though. And some of his productions became hits, but in terms of overall quality, man, did he make movies. And for the purposes of this video, he was also the producer of David Lynch's Dune. And from every source that I've been able to find, David and Dino were constantly butting heads over creative differences with this story. And by that I mean David had so many great ideas for what this movie could be, but Dino was the producer, so what he said goes. Francesca Annis, the actress for Lady Jessica, is quoted saying this: "If David Lynch had been able to make his own film, it would have been brilliant, but unfortunately Dino oversaw every single tiny thing." Of course, there will never be a Lynch cut of this movie, so I can't really attest to whether his version would have been better or not. But from everything that I've heard from the cast and crew, it sounds like it would have been better. Studio interference is never great in a production, so I am forced to wonder how it would have been different. I know for a fact it was David Lynch who came up with the idea of the weirding modules, so his version would have had its problems either way. And with that said, before I close this video, I do want to list off some more positive things I can say about this movie, because there are positive things to say. I'm just not a negative person. If I'm gonna do a video roasting a movie, I need to also say some nice things too. Despite being a box office failure, this film has been praised by Sir Kenneth Branagh, Adam McKay, and Robert Eggers, all of whom are extremely talented people in their own right. This film also marked the beginning of a career friendship between David Lynch and Kyle MacLachlan, who would go on to work together on various projects, including Twin Peaks. There's also the Princess Irulan. Need I say more? And this is also more of a funny one than an actual positive point about this movie, but apparently the entire time they were doing production, Patrick Stewart had no idea who Sting was. And when Sting told him that he was in a band called The Police, apparently Stewart thought that he was in some kind of police band, whatever that means. I found this story in my research and I couldn't not share it. And while this movie was met with negative reviews from many critics, one of the few critics who commented positively about this film was Harlan Ellison. Yeah, the guy who wrote I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I personally definitely think it means something if one of the fathers of sci-fi horror praises your accomplishment in adapting Dune. And those are just a few of the things that I can say positively about this movie. And with that, that's the story of David Lynch's Dune. The story of a director's vision for a story and how a studio can butcher it. The story of an idea that was ahead of its time. And I mean way ahead of its time. And the story of how not to adapt a novel. This is the story of Dune 1984. And so with that said, thank you so much for watching. I love talking about Dune, and after I watched the 1984 adaptation, I knew I just had to make a video roasting it. This is the first time I've ever done a roasting video. On this channel, I talk a lot about the films that I love and films that I think influenced the history and the continuation of cinema. And so it was kind of nice to sit down and just have a good old-fashioned roast. And I think I do have at least one more Dune video in me. Specifically, I want to do a video on the story of Dune Messiah. I want to talk about the story as well as my predictions for what Denis Villeneuve is going to do in his adaptation of that story. I'm not sure if that's going to be my next video or not, but that's definitely going to be one of the videos that you have to look forward to in the future. So stay tuned for that. And in channel news, we passed 5,000 subscribers, which is amazing. Thank you all so much for continuing to watch these videos and support me in doing all this. And speaking of support, huge shout out, of course, to the patrons, Sean, Happy the Knife, and my top tier patrons, RD and Snowy. Thank you so much for your continued support in letting me do this and helping me to achieve my goal of doing this as a job full time. I have so many video ideas that I'm looking forward to, so many ideas that I want to try out, and I hope you'll stick around for the ride. And so with all that said, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another great video. I hope that you're excited for it because I know that I am. And cut.